In the quiet heart of post-Civil War Illinois, where prairie winds once whispered peace, a peculiar family opened their doors to the forgotten children of war. The Witherspoons, a respected Quaker household, were praised for transforming their orchard estate into a sanctuary for orphans. It was meant to be a place of healing, of redemption, of God's grace in action. But by 1869, neighbors began to notice something was wrong. The laughter of children no longer echoed across the fields. The Witherspoon farm grew strangely quiet, yet their trees bore fruit heavier and sweeter than ever before. And then, in the spring of 1871, a traveling minister arrived. What he unearthed beneath the peach trees turned whispers into screams, and left a stain that no one in Clay County would ever speak of again. Tonight, we peel back the soil of history to uncover the secrets buried on that farm. What happened to the children who were never seen again? Why did the orchard thrive in their absence? And why did the family's matriarch begin to speak in tongues no Quaker would ever recognize? This story is not just unsettling, it's unforgettable. So if you're drawn to the shadowed corners of history, where faith, family, and horror intersect, stay with us until the very end. You won't believe what still grows in those fields. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell here are the ones most have tried to forget. And trust me, this one, you'll want to remember. There is no sweeter soil than that which has known sorrow. Martha Witherspoon, 1866. The land was flat and wide in Clay County, Illinois. No mountains to break the horizon, no rivers to carve out boundaries, just endless prairie grass and sky, where the wind could travel for miles without meeting a single obstruction. In the spring of 1865, that wind carried something new with it: silence. The cannons of the Civil War had gone quiet, and with them, the echo of marching boots. But the peace that followed was not peace at all. It was vacancy, an absence that settled into towns and farms and church pews, the hollow, aching absence of men who would never return. Among those left behind were the Witherspoons. Martha and Elias Witherspoon were Quakers, not the kind who whispered their prayers under floorboards or scrawled rebellion into the margins of ledgers, but the kind who baked bread for the widow next door, who handed out coins to the destitute, who never missed a Sunday in the old timber frame meeting house at the center of town. They were respected, trusted. And after the war, when grief draped over the county like a funeral veil, the Witherspoons did what good people were expected to do. They opened their doors. That door opened in the fall of 1866. The orphanage, though it was never formally called that, began with just 3 children. All of them boys. All of them rail-thin and barefoot, shipped west from a battered relief office in Philadelphia. Their fathers had died in battle. Their mothers, if they had any, had died of grief or fever or starvation soon after. There were too many like them in the East, and the Witherspoons had written a letter to say they would take as many as they could feed. It was, in many ways, an act of charity. And yet, strange things happen when charity meets isolation. The Witherspoon estate lay some 4 miles outside the town of Flora, nestled in a shallow depression between 2 low hills. The locals called the place Sorrow's Fold, a name that seemed too poetic for such flat terrain. The land there was unusually fertile, even during dry seasons. The orchard blossomed early. That orchard was Elias's pride, rows upon rows of peach and plum trees, some of them decades old. Fruit from the Lord's table, he would say, wiping sweat from his brow as he hauled bushels into town. By 1867, there were 12 children on the property, all of them orphans, all of them never seen again. The townspeople remember odd things. They remember that Martha, once chatty and generous, stopped coming to church. They remember that Elias stopped selling fruit at the town market and began trading in private, behind closed doors. They remember that on Sundays, the windows of the farmhouse, every one of them, were covered in thick linen sheets, even in summer. The laughter of children, which had once echoed across the fields, faded to nothing. But memory is unreliable. And when the land is generous and a family has known tragedy, who is anyone to question their silence? That silence deepened when the traveling preacher came through in the summer of 1867. Reverend Amos Bell, a weathered man with river-water eyes and calloused hands, arrived on foot, wearing a sun-bleached hat and a coat 2 sizes too large. He had no parish, just a Bible and a battered satchel. He claimed he'd been sent by a Methodist mission society back east to check on the orphaned. There was no official record of this, of course, only Martha's own words, written later in a letter never mailed. He came through the orchard like he had every right to be there. No hat in hand, no regard for the Lord's quiet work. Just those eyes. Judging. Measuring. like he already knew what lay beneath the trees. The Witherspoons let him stay one night. The next morning, Reverend Bell was gone. Gone, and never seen again. No horses were taken. No wagon was missing. But the ground in the orchard bore fresh footprints that led in but not out. Some said he must have walked on to the next town. Others believed the children had scared him off, though no one ever explained how. The Witherspoons, when asked, said only that he was not ready to witness God's work. In the following weeks, a stink began to settle over the peach trees. Elias claimed it was the soil adjusting to summer. Martha said a raccoon had died in the roots. Yet the fruit that year was extraordinary, as if the trees had been fed something far richer than compost and rainwater. The townsfolk who tasted those peaches swore they were the best they'd ever eaten. Sweet, almost too sweet, like sugar soaked in sorrow. But the children were never seen again. No schoolhouse records. No doctor's visits. No one remembers ever hearing the sound of a child's voice on that land again. A few curious neighbors, mostly farmers whose own lands bordered Sorrow's Fold, ventured close in late 1868, hoping to glimpse the orphans at play. What they saw instead chilled them. Dozens of dolls, wooden, hand-carved, had been hung from the lower branches of the orchard trees. Not tied by the neck, as a child might do, but carefully sewn into pouches of linen and placed in the crooks of branches, like infants being laid to sleep. Each one had a different face, etched with burnt ink into the wood. Some bore smiles. Others had tears. All had names stitched into the cloth beneath them. And those names did not match any in the town registry. Sheriff Thomas Reardon visited the farm soon after. The official reason, according to surviving documents, was to ask about taxes. But in his own journal, recovered in 1909, he wrote something different. I needed to see for myself. I'd heard too many stories about silence and fruit. When I arrived, Elias greeted me with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other. Said he was tending to the Lord's orchard. I asked about the children. He pointed toward the trees and said, "They're where the light is strongest." I left without finishing my tea. No charges were filed. No children were found. And yet, still, the orchard grew. In the spring of 1870, the Witherspoons announced they would no longer take in children. The farmhouse curtains were drawn permanently. Martha was only seen once more, at a general store in town, buying salt and candles. She looked thinner, pale. Her hands were wrapped in gauze. The clerk claimed she trembled the entire time and muttered something about seeds that weep. Then, in March of 1871, a storm came through Clay County. A rare spring thunderstorm, heavy with wind and lightning. It struck the orchard just after dusk. 3 trees were split down the center. The next morning, a neighbor's son, 14 years old and bold from boredom, ventured into the property to see the damage. He did not return. The neighbor himself, a Mr. Harlan Tates, entered the orchard just before noon, rifle in hand. What he found under the split trees has been lost to history, but he returned ashen-faced and refused to ever speak of it. He did, however, send a letter to Reverend Eli Blackthorne, a circuit preacher in Vandalia, urging him to come at once. Reverend Blackthorne arrived within the week. His journal, preserved in the county archives, contains the following passage. The orchard breathes. I do not say this in jest. I stood among those rows, the trees groaning like they remembered something ancient and violent. The earth underfoot was soft, too soft. I dug, against my better judgment, and uncovered fabric. Threadbare, stained. It had once been a child's shirt. I left before I uncovered more. It was then, and only then, that the authorities returned. Sheriff Reardon led a formal search of the Witherspoon farm in April of 1871. By then, the orchard had begun to rot. The fruit shriveled on the trees. The grass browned at the edges. The dolls were gone. In their place, small holes had been dug beneath the roots, shallow, almost reverent. Inside many of them, scraps of children's belongings were found. Shoes, buttons, hair ribbons, bits of bone. Martha Witherspoon was found kneeling in the parlor, hands folded in her lap, lips cracked and bleeding. Elias was discovered in the barn, hanging from the rafters with a belt tied to a rusted shovel. On the back wall, in his handwriting, were the words, "The fruit is full." No bodies of children were ever officially recovered. No burial records exist. The state took possession of the land and deemed it cursed. But the orchard returned. 5 years later, in 1876, a new family, the Kleins, moved onto the land, and tried to regrow peaches. They lasted 3 summers. Then, without explanation, they left in the night, leaving behind everything. The house, the barn, even the horses. The trees still bloom, now and then, when the soil is warm enough and the wind is still. But no one dares pick the fruit. Because the names are still whispered under the branches, if you listen close. And they're not the names of the living. It was not the children who screamed first. It was the birds. In the spring of 1868, neighbors living near the Witherspoon property began noticing something unusual. Sparrows, wrens, even crows, all once a common sight flitting through the orchard, had vanished. Gone without warning. No nests, no feathers, not even the caw of a morning scavenger. It was as if the land itself had gone mute. Mr. Adley, who owned a feed store a few miles east of Sorrow's Fold, claimed he saw hundreds of birds spiraling above the orchard one dusky morning. As if trapped in place, he wrote in his personal diary, circling, 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 never daring to land. As though the trees themselves had grown teeth. It's easy to ignore birds, but harder to ignore children. In late May, a delivery man by the name of Calvin Roscoe made a routine stop to deliver sacks of flour and dried beans to the Witherspoon household. He had been making the trip monthly for nearly a year. In his words, the place had always been quiet but clean, Martha with her apron, Elias with his boots muddied, both of them courteous but strange in that prairie way. But this time he noticed something odd. It was a letter, not addressed to him, not even properly sealed. Just a folded piece of paper that had slipped out from under the sack of flour as he passed it to Martha. Before she could snatch it back, he caught a glimpse of childish handwriting. Scrawled in pencil, "We are not allowed to go outside anymore. Even when the sun is out. Even when it's our birthday. Please send someone." Martha's hand trembled as she took it from him. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to offer an explanation, but no sound came out. She simply closed the door. Roscoe didn't speak of it again for years. Not until the trial that never truly happened. But that letter was just one of several, never mailed, never sent. In the years that followed, at least 11 handwritten notes would be discovered beneath the floorboards of the Witherspoon farmhouse. Most were addressed to God, some to strangers. One, chillingly, to the orchard itself. The paper was old, brittle, faint with time, but the words remained. They buried Timothy in the garden, but not like a real burial. They said he was a seed now, and we should water him with our prayers. Another, I dream of bells. They hang in the trees like fruit and ring when I try to sleep. No names were signed, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of children. And yet, no missing persons report was ever filed. The orphans who came to the Witherspoon estate were part of a fractured, chaotic post-war system. Many had no family left to ask questions. Many were never recorded properly in the first place. A lost child in 1868 could disappear as easily as smoke from a chimney. Still, some townsfolk had questions. Quiet ones. Whispers over evening fires. The blacksmith's wife, Miss Langley, confided to a friend that she once saw Martha walking alone at twilight. Her dress smeared with what looked like ash, her arms cradling nothing, yet swaying gently as if rocking a child to sleep. Her lips were moving, she said, but no sound came out. Others claimed they saw the orchard lit by lanterns in the dead of night. Figures moving between the trees. Low chanting. Elias's voice raised in what some said was prayer, others said was song, and a few whispered, with growing certainty, was something closer to a ritual. By the end of June, rumors began to congeal into something darker. It started with a fire. Not at the Witherspoon estate, but at a barn less than a mile away, belonging to the Haskins family. They awoke to flames licking up the eastern wall of the structure, animals screaming, straw catching like tinder. It was only by blind luck that the fire didn't spread to the house. When they searched the barn after the blaze, they found something far worse than charred wood. In the ashes near the rear corner of the barn was a bundle of twine, and wrapped inside it, scorched and blackened, were children's teeth. Too small for livestock, too rounded for anything else. 9 of them, arranged in a ring. Sheriff Reardon was called. His report, now partially illegible due to mold and water damage, noted the following. No known trespassers. No signs of forced entry. The Haskins children are unharmed. But the pattern is unsettling. We'll conduct interviews discreetly. He never mentioned the Witherspoons directly. Not then. Not yet. But privately. In his journal, he wrote something more pointed. I fear the old orchard hides more than fruit. The dreams are worsening. I hear weeping when I sleep. The dreams were not his alone. Several residents of Flora and its surrounding farmland began reporting vivid, unsettling nightmares. One girl, just 8 years old, drew pictures of peach trees bleeding from their trunks. Another claimed her brother spoke in his sleep, repeating the same phrase over and over. The bells are getting closer. It was in August of that same year, 1868, that the first confirmed disappearance occurred. Her name was Tansy Millbrook, just 6 years old. Her mother, a seamstress, often walked her along the road between their home and the old meeting house where sewing commissions were gathered. It was a path that passed, though only briefly, within sight of the Witherspoon property. On the morning she vanished, Tansy had stopped to pick a flower, or so her mother believed. She turned her back for seconds. Seconds. When she looked again, the child was gone. There were no footprints, no cries, no blood, just a single daisy lying crushed in the dirt. A search party was formed. Men with dogs scoured the fields. They pounded on the Witherspoon door. Elias answered, hatless, calm. He claimed they hadn't seen the girl. Invited the sheriff to inspect the house. And the sheriff did. According to records, Elias gave them full permission to search the house and barn, but not the orchard. We are grieving today, he said, his eyes dry. There is a funeral among the trees. A spiritual one. No one but the Lord is welcome among the roots. The sheriff, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of fear, did not press the matter. The search yielded nothing. Tansy was declared lost to the woods, or, by some, taken by wolves. But no one in town had seen a wolf in over a year. That same week, Martha was spotted hanging small paper dolls from the branches of the trees nearest the house. Each had a smile drawn in ink and one word scrawled across the chest. Belonging. And then the bells began. Not real ones, not at first, but whispered accounts. Sounds described as chimes in a breeze that wasn't there. They came at night, mostly, between 2 and 4 in the morning, faint and rhythmic, as if from wind chimes hanging deep in the orchard. No one admitted to investigating, but everyone heard them. A farmer named Amos Corbin, emboldened by whiskey and bitterness, took a lantern one night and marched into the peach trees. His wife begged him not to. She later testified that he told her, if they're keeping angels in cages, I want to see their wings. He never returned. What had returned was his lantern, left burning at the edge of the orchard, beside a small pile of broken fingernails. It was the final straw for some. A petition was drafted. A meeting called at the local church. The people of Flora were done with silence. They demanded the Witherspoons be brought to account. But the day before the petition could be delivered, the church doors were found open, though they had been locked the night before, and all 38 signatures had been erased. Not scratched out. Erased. Clean as chalk. No one could explain it. Except Martha. She appeared at the next Sunday service, unannounced, dressed in a veil of black lace. She sat in the back pew, silent as stone, and only stood during the final hymn. As the congregation rose to sing Nearer, My God, to Thee, she lifted her head, and those who saw her swear that her eyes were entirely white, not rolled back, not blind, but empty, as if scraped clean. She sang only one line, louder than the rest. Though like the wanderer, the sun gone down. Then she turned and walked out. That was the last time she was seen in public. After that, the town grew quiet again. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. The Witherspoons no longer came into town. No more deliveries were made. No more children were sent to them. And the orchard? It flourished. A traveler passing through that winter wrote a letter to his wife in Ohio. He had seen the orchard from the road, the snow curling around the trees like ghosts. He wrote, The strangest thing, Sarah, every tree was in bloom. In December, full blossoms. No fruit, but the petals were thick and red like little tongues. It made me think of our baby, the one we lost. I could almost hear her crying. This letter was dated 2 weeks before the bodies were found. But that is for another chapter. What matters here, what darkens the blood in our veins even now, is that by the end of 1868, Sorrow's Fold was no longer merely a farm. It was a boundary, a place where grief, silence, and something far older than the Witherspoons had made a pact. A place where children wrote letters no one would read, where bells rang in the dark, where dolls wept ink tears and trees bore fruit on bones. And in the town of Flora, no one dared say what they already knew, that the orphans were still there, buried, rooted, watered, Waiting. There was a thin fog rolling in that morning. Not the kind that obscures your vision, but the kind that softens the edges of things. Makes fences seem like ribs in the earth. Makes trees look like they're breathing. Makes you walk slower, like something is watching from behind the wet gray air. It was on such a morning, in late February of 1869, that Reverend Silas Marin arrived in Flora, Illinois. He was a tall man, narrow as a lamppost. His collar was the stiff kind, high at the neck, with a small tear at the seam that had been hand-stitched. His Bible was not black leather but soft brown hide, wrapped twice with a cord. He did not preach loudly, nor did he thump the pulpit. Instead, he sat with the elderly, held hands, asked questions that most men of God weren't brave enough to ask. He had served in Tennessee during the war, working as a chaplain in the burnt-out fields of Murfreesboro. He had seen what hunger did to soldiers, and worse, what it did to children. He came to Flora by request. A letter. No return address. Just a message scratched in ink that had bled through the paper. There are children here that are not children. The orchard speaks when no one is near it, and a woman prays with no God in her mouth. There was no signature, but Reverend Marin came all the same. At first, the townsfolk were polite. They offered him coffee, asked about his travels, smiled too hard. But no one wanted to talk about the Witherspoons. Not directly. They said the orchard hadn't bloomed again yet, which was strange, given that it had bloomed in December. They said the wind had changed direction, blowing east to west, like it was avoiding something in the soil. They said their dogs had stopped barking, and the firewood in their stoves hissed like it was wet, even when dry. Reverend Marin took notes. He also listened at night. He rented a room at the far end of town, just off the old rail spur. It was close enough to the road that led to the Witherspoon farm, and far enough from town to hear what the prairie whispered. Each night, he sat by the window and wrote in a small green notebook. The entry for March 3rd reads, "Heard bells again at 2:17 a.m. Not wind chimes. Rhythmic. Hollow, like water dripping into copper bowls. Sound moved from east to west, through the trees. No footsteps. No wind. But I smelled sulfur and something faintly like syrup." By mid-March, he'd made up his mind. He would go to the orchard. But first, he needed a guide. That guide came in the form of Gideon Harper, a boy of 16 with red hair and a crooked tooth. Gideon had worked for the Witherspoons 2 summers prior, hauling wood and tending chickens before the animals all mysteriously vanished. He didn't like to talk about it. But Reverend Marin had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like questions. And eventually, Gideon told him what he'd seen. Not all of it. Just enough. He said the trees had names. Not names like Peach or Cherry. Names that Elias would whisper when no one else was near. Names that didn't sound like English. Names that made your skin tighten around your bones when you heard them. He said he once saw Martha standing barefoot in the orchard at dawn, humming while the ground around her steamed, even though the air was still cold. He said he found small shoes in the barn. Dozens of them. All unlaced. All facing east. So on the gray morning of March 12, 1869, Reverend Marin and Gideon Harper made their way toward the Witherspoon estate. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't knock on the front door. They walked through the side pasture, careful not to be seen, and entered the orchard from the north edge, where the fence had long since collapsed into weeds. At first, it was silent. No birds. No wind. Just the soft creak of tree limbs and a breeze that didn't exist. Gideon stopped walking after 30 yards. His lips had gone pale. His hands were shaking. He whispered, "I can't go further. I hear something humming in my teeth." Reverend Marin nodded, told him to wait. And then the Reverend stepped into the trees alone. The first thing he noticed was the color of the bark. It was not the gray-brown you'd expect of peach trees in winter. It was darker, nearly black, and it shimmered slightly in the weak daylight, as though damp with oil. The ground beneath was dry, but the soil looked freshly turned. Not everywhere. Just in patches. Mounds. As if the earth had been disturbed and smoothed again. He passed 27 trees before he saw the first charm. It hung from a branch like a fishing lure. Twine. Feathers. A child's tooth bound in thread. It spun gently, even though the air was still. There were more. Dozens. Some were made of string. Some of hair. Some had bits of what looked like dried flesh or onion skin, pale and curled at the edges. All hung at eye level. All swayed. And then he heard it. A voice. Not loud. Not angry. Just a whisper. From the base of one of the trees. He turned and approached. There, beneath the lowest limb, half buried in moss and damp leaves, was a small trapdoor. It was no wider than a coffin. He opened it. The hinges didn't squeal. They were well-oiled, as if someone had used them recently. A narrow wooden staircase led down into darkness. He lit a match. Then a second. The first had gone out immediately. The descent was short, maybe 10 steps, but the air shifted with each one. It grew thicker. Not musty, as one would expect in a cellar, but sweet. Sickeningly so, like overripe fruit left in the sun. And something beneath it, something acrid, like old teeth and vinegar. At the bottom was a room, no bigger than a chapel, carved into the dirt, reinforced with beams. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat rows of dolls. Not porcelain, not store-bought, handmade, each from what looked like burlap, or skin, or wax. Some had human hair. Some had missing limbs. All had their eyes sewn shut. In the center of the room was a stone basin, filled with water. No, not water. It was too dark, too thick. Reverend Marin stepped closer. In the black surface of the basin, he saw his own reflection. But it was wrong. His eyes were closed in the reflection, but they were open in real life. His mouth was moving, but he wasn't speaking, and the voice he heard was not his own. The children are learning. The children are listening. The roots do not forget. He stumbled backward. His foot struck something soft. He turned and saw a child, no older than 5, pale, thin, kneeling in the dirt with her hands over her eyes. He asked her name. She didn't respond. He touched her shoulder, and she whispered, "The bells are under the dirt now." Then she vanished. Not in smoke, not in shadow. She simply wasn't there anymore. Reverend Marin fled the room, climbed the stairs, burst from the trapdoor and into the gray light. The orchard was different now. The trees had moved. The rows were no longer straight. He was surrounded. He ran. He made it back to the road, where Gideon was waiting, pale with fear. Neither of them spoke on the walk back. That night, Marin wrote a single line in his notebook. "There is a church beneath the trees, and the congregation does not blink." The following morning, he went to Sheriff Reardon, told him everything. The sheriff listened in silence. When Marin finished, Reardon poured a drink, drank it, then stood. "I'll go," he said. He gathered 6 men, all volunteers. Some carried lanterns. Some carried shovels. One brought a pistol. They set out that evening, just before dusk. They never made it to the orchard, because halfway there, they found Elias Witherspoon, hanging from a tree outside the barn, not by a noose, but by his wrists nailed to the uppermost branch like a broken marionette. His mouth had been sewn shut, his eyes removed and placed in his open palms. The sheriff vomited. One man fainted. Reverend Marin knelt, not in prayer, but in disbelief. Who had done this? Why now? They cut Elias down. But as they lowered him, something slipped from his coat pocket. A page. Torn. Bloodstained. It read, "They're almost ready. The harvest will begin when the bells ring from below. We are only the root keepers. The true Father comes in bloom." That night, the orchard bloomed again. In March, the trees bled pink, and not a single soul dared enter the grove again. But someone would, soon, and what they found beneath the trees would make Flora infamous forever. The spring of 1869 came early to Clay County. Too early. By March 18th, the skies had turned a colorless white, like the lid of a pot about to boil. The peach trees on the Witherspoon farm, once dormant, now stood in full, violent bloom. Locals reported that the blossoms were not the soft pinks of ordinary fruit trees, but something richer, redder, veined, as if the petals had been pumped full of blood. And they smelled sweet, cloying, even, a scent that made children dizzy and dogs howl through the night. After the discovery of Elias Witherspoon's mutilated body, the town of Flora descended into a quiet, shaken panic. The orchard was cordoned off with rusted barbed wire. No one dared approach. Sheriff Reardon, a man whose life had previously been occupied by livestock disputes and drunken brawls at the train depot, now found himself the unwilling steward of what many were beginning to call a cursed place. But questions demanded answers, and so the sheriff made a call to the state capitol. By March 24th, 3 men arrived by rail from Springfield: U.S. Marshal Leonard Briggs, forensic investigator Thomas Keene, and a civilian consultant by the name of Dr. Harmon Bellamy. They came dressed in long black coats and wide-brimmed hats, their suitcases lined with surgical instruments, notebooks, and a sense of urgency. They were not told the full truth, only that a wealthy family had suffered a tragedy and that dozens of children, wards of the state, were now unaccounted for. Their first stop was the barn. The barn stood about 50 yards from the house, and though the wood looked solid from a distance, the smell gave it away. Something had rotted there. Recently, inside, the investigators found what remained of a ledger. Half-burned, but legible in places. Dr. Bellamy was the first to notice the numbers. Between 1866 and 1869, the Witherspoons had been sent 72 children from state orphanages. The barn ledger documented their arrival dates, physical descriptions, and assigned chores. But there was no record of departures. No adoptions. No transfers. Not a single child listed had ever officially left the farm. And the last page, scorched at the edges, held a single phrase. "We keep what the war left behind. The soil makes them whole." Marshal Briggs demanded the orchard be searched, but Sheriff Reardon hesitated. He told the marshal what Reverend Marin had found beneath the trapdoor. The dolls, the stone basin, the voice. Briggs waved it off, called it superstition. But Dr. Bellamy didn't. He asked to speak with Marin directly. That conversation took place on the church steps, under a sky that had turned greenish with humidity. Bellamy took notes. He asked if Marin had hallucinated before, if he had eaten or drank anything strange. Marin simply handed him the notebook. The pages detailing the orchard, the child with no name, the whisper from the basin. Bellamy read in silence, then closed the book. "We dig," he said. They returned to the orchard on March 25th with 6 hired men and 2 bloodhounds. They began digging at the base of the oldest tree, the one closest to the trapdoor. By the end of the first hour, they had unearthed 6 small shoes. By the end of the second, a femur. By sunset, the number of bones was too high to count. Small skulls, rib cages, worn buttons, a child's eyeglass lens, all buried in concentric circles. Each tree had a body, or more. The hired men fled. Reardon vomited again. Even Briggs went pale. But Bellamy and Keene stayed. They cataloged everything, took sketches, bagged samples. And in the soil itself, they found something stranger still. Teeth. Thousands of them, mixed into the dirt like gravel. Too many to belong to the remains they'd uncovered. And each one polished to a shine, as though they'd been cleaned. That night, Marin heard bells again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Gideon Harper, still shaken from his earlier visit, burst into the church just after 2 a.m. He claimed to have seen children standing in the fields behind his home, not walking, just standing, silent, watching, their eyes too wide and mouths slightly open as though waiting for something to be poured in. Reverend Marin wrote it down. March 26th. The children appear where the orchard's shadow falls. They do not blink. They do not speak. Meanwhile, Bellamy made a discovery. In one of the smaller outbuildings behind the Witherspoon home, what had once served as a dairy shed, he found a trunk. Locked, rusted. Inside were letters. Not from the state, not from orphanages, but from a man signed only as Father Oram. The letters were strange. Half prayer, half instruction manual. They spoke of soil rights and blood harmonics, of the need to create vessels that could one day hold the root mind. One passage read, "When the orchard breathes, the veil lifts, and beneath the veil, the old mouths bloom. Feed them. Listen. Do not try to understand. Understanding is a curse reserved for those too proud to kneel." Marin was called in again. He read the letters, said nothing, just closed his eyes, because he had begun to dream. Every night now, the same dream, a long table under the orchard trees. Children seated, but none eating. At the head of the table sat a figure, tall, root-covered, faceless. It hummed in a pitch that made Marin's jaw ache. When he woke, his pillow was wet with blood. Not from his nose, from his ears. He was not the only one. Dr. Bellamy suffered a seizure on the morning of March 28th. Found in his rented room, eyes rolled back, muttering a name no one recognized. Galdena. It would appear in Marin's notes the next day. It spoke its name. Through Bellamy. Through the wind. Through the roots. The orchard is no longer trees. It is memory, growing. By April 1st, the town of Flora was no longer functional. Children stopped going to school. Men refused to work past dusk. Women reported that mirrors in their homes had begun to cloud over, showing not reflections but visions of underground tunnels. And the trees? They grew. Overnight, their branches stretched. Bark split open. Blossoms dropped and rotted into meat-like sludge. One tree's trunk opened entirely, revealing a cavity lined with cloth and small bones. Marin knew then they had not stopped anything, only awakened it. The orchard was not planted. It was summoned. And whatever it fed, whatever it bloomed for, was not yet done feeding. Bellamy fled that night, took the train east, was never heard from again. Marshall Briggs resigned 2 weeks later, retired to Kentucky, shot himself in the chest in the summer of 1871. The orchard remained, fenced, silent, but not empty, because beneath it, something waited. And every spring, when the wind turned and the peach blossoms fell red against the soil, the people of Flora remembered. They remembered what they tried to forget, and they listened for bells. April 3rd, 1869 began with silence. No birdsong, no wind through the grass. The town of Flora had learned not to open its curtains too early. Not after what had happened to the Reynolds boy, who, upon drawing his blinds one dawn, had reportedly stood motionless for hours, watching something that hovered just above the orchard, something he described later as the upside-down tree that grows from sky to root. So when Reverend Marin was woken not by bells or dreams, but by 3 knocks on the church door, he approached it cautiously. Standing there was a girl. She could not have been older than 10. Barefoot, pale. Her hair was black and soaked with morning dew. In one hand, she held a folded piece of linen, in the other, a wooden spoon carved into the shape of a lamb. Her eyes were wrong. Not empty, not vacant, but too knowing. When Marin asked her name, she answered twice. Claire, she said. Then, after a pause, and the other name is in the dirt. He brought her inside, gave her bread. She didn't eat, just watched the rafters of the chapel as if listening for echoes. Marin wrote in his journal, April 3rd. The child arrived, the one they promised. She smells of turned earth and ash. I asked about her parents. She said, they're in the seams now. I don't know what that means. The townsfolk were reluctant to take her in. Not after what had been found in the orchard. Not after the trees had bled. So Marin kept her at the church. Claire rarely slept. At night, she would hum songs in languages no one recognized. At times, her voice would deepen mid-sentence. Other times, she would speak backwards, perfectly fluid. When asked why, she said she was trying to remember how they used to speak before the orchard forgot. By April 7th, more children began to report dreams. Not nightmares, exactly, but visions. Of standing in rows. Of hands reaching up from the soil to hold theirs. Of a lullaby sung in a circular melody, a tune that looped without end. The town schoolteacher, Miss Aniba Fields, tried to document the drawings her students were producing. All the same. Circles within circles. Roots wrapping around figures seated beneath trees. One child, Sarah Nels, drew a picture of Claire. But she gave her 3 eyes. And none were on her face. Dr. Harmon Bellamy, still presumed to be traveling, had in fact returned to Illinois, hiding under the name Mr. Hem. He had taken lodging just outside Flora, near the edge of the swampy timberline. In letters never mailed, he wrote of hearing voices in water, of trees growing faster than he could sketch, of something he called root pulse beneath the cabin floorboards. One letter, found later, ended with, they called it a farm, but it was never for children. It was for germination. I believe now that the Witherspoons weren't feeding the orchard. They were obeying it. On the night of April 10th, Claire disappeared. Marin awoke to find the chapel door open. Muddy footprints led to the orchard. He followed. The trees had bloomed again, this time with blossoms like open mouths. He found Claire at the base of the oldest peach tree. She was not alone. 12 figures stood around her. Children. The lost ones. Their clothes were tattered, their eyes milk-white. But they smiled. Claire turned to Marin and said, they're not gone. They're rooted. And now, they bloom through me. The tree behind her split open with a sound like tearing cloth. Inside, Marin saw shelves. Not of wood, of bone. Holding jars. And in each jar, something moved. Twitched. Waited. Claire stepped aside. She beckoned him. But Marin ran. He didn't stop until sunrise. He didn't tell the townsfolk. Not yet. But that day, he carved a symbol into the church's threshold. A warning. The same shape found at the bottom of the orchard ledger. A spiral within a triangle. The next day, every bell in town rang once. And then never rang again. The town of Flora had changed. Roads bent slightly, though no one could say how. People began to forget names. The preacher's sermons turned to riddles. And Claire? She returned, smiling, but now wearing a necklace made of doll arms. She said it was a gift. From the soil. And beneath her skin, something pulsed. Like roots remembering rain. By mid-April 1869, the ground around Flora no longer behaved. The soil was soft where it should have been firm. Shallow graves, once filled and blessed, were found open, the coffins tilted as if pushed from below. In the southern fields, saplings erupted in perfect circles, their trunks bleeding resin that smelled like burnt sugar and copper. And every morning at precisely 4:03 a.m., the townspeople were woken by a sound no one could find the source of, a single, deep chime. Not a bell from any tower. Not metal. Something older. The harvest bell, they called it. Reverend Marin marked its tone in his journal. April 13th. The sound is not heard with the ears. It moves through the teeth, through the ribs. It stirs the marrow. It is not a bell. It is a summons. Claire heard it too. Every morning, she stood in the church doorway, still as stone, humming in unison with the bell's vibration. By now, she had begun to change. The whites of her eyes were laced with root-like veins. Her fingers bore crescent scars, as though she had been digging in soil that bit back. Children around town began vanishing. Not all at once. Slowly. One here. Another the next night. No struggle. No sign of entry. Their beds untouched. Their shoes still warm. Miss Aniba Fields compiled a list. 19 names by April 16th. Each child under 11. Each one known to have drawn or spoken of the orchard in the previous weeks. Sheriff Reardon attempted a lockdown. Families were told to stay indoors. Windows were boarded. Curfews set. But it didn't matter. The children disappeared even from locked rooms. And the soil? It grew louder. That was how Bellamy described it when he returned again, unannounced, on April 17th. Dirty, thinner, wild-eyed. He spoke at the town meeting with gravel in his voice. You are living in the mouth of something ancient. The orchard is not the source. It is the symptom. He held up a map, not a modern one, but a stitched hide map from the 1700s, marked with the same spiral within triangle sigil Marin had carved on the church. It was an indigenous warning, he explained. A cartographic scar. This land had been avoided, unnamed on purpose. For centuries. The Witherspoons didn't claim cursed land. The land claimed them. The townsfolk demanded proof. Bellamy gave them bones. From his satchel, he produced a child's femur, but twisted, calcified in a spiral. Another was smooth, but humming faintly when placed on the table. Vibrating. Marin was the only one who didn't look away. He asked Bellamy if the orchard had ever stopped. Bellamy laughed. Stopped? Reverend, this is its blooming year. The harvest is the reason. And that was the first time the town heard the phrase, the root mind wakes. That night, April 17th, Gideon Harper, still guilt-racked from abandoning the Witherspoon boys, walked into the orchard alone. He left a note on his nightstand. If they ask where I've gone, tell them I went to listen beneath the trees. His body was never found. But on April 18th, the trees bore fruit. Not peaches. Something else. They hung low from the branches, ovoid and dark, wrapped in wet membranes. Sheriff Reardon shot one down with his rifle. When it hit the earth, it split open. Inside was a child. Not dead. Not breathing, either. Suspended in some kind of sleep, its eyes fluttering beneath lids of translucent skin. Marin screamed. Bellamy wept. Claire smiled. She said, they are becoming. Panic overtook Flora. Families fled. But the roads were wrong. Paths looped back. Horses refused to step past the church. One man, trying to ride east to Mattoon, found himself arriving back at the Witherspoon gate after 6 hours of straight riding. Inside the church, Marin found that his crucifix had bent. Not broken, just bent sideways, as if the wood had softened and drooped under invisible heat. Pages in his Bible had rewritten themselves. Psalm 23 now read. Yeah, though I bloom in the valley of the root mind, I shall not wake, for the soil remembers me. Claire slept beneath the altar that night. Her skin was cold. Her pulse, reversed. Bellamy made his last entry. April 19th. The harvest bell tolls tomorrow. It will not stop. It will grow until the marrow in every living spine hums in unison. The children are not being taken. They're being collected. And what comes next is not death. It is invitation. At 4:03 a.m. on April 20th, the sound returned. But louder. This time, the ground around the orchard opened. Not cracked. Not shattered. Opened. A spiral staircase of root-veined stone, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, sank into the earth beneath the oldest peach tree. From it rose a wind. Sweet. Wet. Alive. Claire stood at its edge. Behind her, the fruit things pulsed on their branches. The remaining children of Flora walked forward. One by one. They did not look back. Only Marin stood between them and the stair. and Claire took his hand. "It will bloom through you too, if you let it," she said. "Come listen. Come kneel." Marin dropped his Bible. He knelt and followed them below. At dawn, the orchard was empty, but from the soil, the bell kept ringing, and no one in Flora ever heard silence again. The morning after the harvest bell rang unbroken, the town of Flora was no longer on any map. This was not metaphor. Train conductors reported missing the stop entirely. Postal riders passed where the roads should have been, only to find uninterrupted forest. Surveyors returning to Springfield claimed the central region had reorganized. When asked to elaborate, they shook their heads and said, "The trees wouldn't let us mark it." The railroad records were altered without explanation. Flora's county clerks disappeared, along with their ledgers. State officials investigating the Witherspoon property turned back before arriving, each citing a different reason: a sick child, a broken wagon axle, a feeling in the chest they described as the slow panic of drowning. Those who stayed in Flora no longer tried to send letters. The post office had gone soft, literally. The walls pulsed faintly when touched, and ink bled from envelopes left overnight. One telegram sent in desperation read, "Flora isn't sinking. It's turning." By April 22nd, Reverend Marin was no longer seen in town. Claire remained, but she no longer walked. She drifted. Her feet hovered a hair above the floor, leaving no footprints. The doll-arm necklace had lengthened, now trailing behind her like a bride's train. When she spoke, her voice echoed even outdoors. When asked where the other children were, she answered simply, "Below." Those who ventured into the orchard did not return, except for Timothy Baines, who came out changed. He was 7 years old and blind, but he claimed to have seen everything. In his words, "They don't die. They go deeper. They root through the bones. They grow new faces, and they speak the old name of the soil." Timothy drew a map. No landmarks, no buildings. Only a spiral, descending inward. At the center, a tree with eyes. Not branches. Eyes. Dozens of them. And beneath it, jars filled with breath. Miss Aniba Fields, who had been documenting every occurrence, went missing on April 25th. Her journal was found in the schoolhouse, open to a final, unfinished entry. The root mind is not one thing. It is memory. Every grief buried. Every lost child, every abandoned promise. The orchard remembers what the living forget. That same day, Bellamy's cabin ignited without flame. Witnesses saw it shimmer like heat off a stone, then collapse inward. In its place, a sapling, already 6 feet tall, and humming. Flora's borders warped. The sun rose and set at different angles. Clocks spun backward. Names unraveled in people's mouths. A man named Edwin took to writing his name in chalk on his door each morning, afraid he'd forget it by nightfall. By May, he simply wrote me. Claire's eyes became mirrors. She said the orchard had bloomed fully now, and the next phase was song. Not a melody, a resonance. The kind that speaks in ribs and riverbeds, she said. On May 5th, the harvest bell rang 20 times, and the dead began to walk. Not as ghouls, not as corpses, but as flickering afterimages. Glimpses. One man saw his late wife standing beside their stove, boiling something that shimmered like wind. A child found her grandfather in the garden, weeping without eyes. They did not speak. They just watched. The orchard now spread beyond its original bounds. Trees appeared in alleyways. Saplings grew from rooftops. Roots split brick foundations like soft loam. Every peach bore a face. Some recognizable, some not. And the spiral staircase? It grew wider. Its rim now ringed with old shoes. Children's shoes. Tiny, worn, waiting. By May 12th, those still in Flora no longer asked questions. They sang. In sleep. In waking. In whispers. A song with no words, only intention. And the soil remembered every verse. By mid-May of 1869, the center of Flora was no longer its town square. It was the orchard. No longer confined by fences or boundaries, it pulsed outward with purpose. Saplings pushed through wooden floorboards, cracked open wells, and sprouted from the spines of the dead. The town's architecture became irrelevant. Roof lines sagged under creeping branches. Chimneys coughed pollen instead of smoke. The buildings breathed, sighing with every gust of wind that came up from the roots. Claire no longer appeared human. Her hair had grayed not with age, but with ash. Her pupils were black rings with moving lines inside them, like tree rings turning endlessly. She did not speak unless spoken to. But when she did, her voice came from nearby trees as much as from her mouth. The phrase she repeated most was, "All memory grows downward." On May 15th, the church bell fell from its tower. Not from weather or time, but from refusal. The stone itself had softened around its moorings. It didn't crash to the ground. It was taken, swallowed by the soil midair. Marin's crucifix was found melted into the wood of his pulpit. On it, a new symbol, the spiral within the triangle, branded as though by heat. Down in the orchard, the staircase was no longer hidden beneath the earth. It stood open at all hours, rimmed with fungal lanterns and the smell of ripe breath. Those who approached it reported the sense of being seen from below. Some walked down. Some crawled. None returned in their original form. Timothy Baines, the blind boy who had once escaped, was found at the steps on May 17th. He was smiling. His eyes were no longer sealed shut but grown over with bark. He said, "It remembers everything, even the things we pretend never happened. The soil is not cruel. It's just honest." Below, in the deep, the orchard had become a cathedral. The tree with eyes stood in the center, taller than any steeple, its branches lifting into blackness. Each eye blinked at a different pace. Some wept sap. Others flicked left and right as though reading invisible text. Around it, the children moved slowly, as if underwater. They were not asleep. They were not awake. They were becoming. They hummed the memory song in harmony. Claire descended on May 18th. She walked the spiral staircase with open arms. Beneath her feet, the steps pulsed with old light. Bellamy's journal pages drifted down ahead of her, carried on wind that came from no direction. The root mind, she whispered, was the memory of grief given root. Not a god, not a devil, but something older, the land's mourning made flesh. Every forgotten child, every buried sin, every lie nailed into church doors. It grew there, waited. The root mind, she said, had waited long enough. At the base of the tree, Marin knelt. He no longer wore his collar. His fingernails were black with soil. He cradled one of the fruit sacks that held a child inside. His voice was low, cracked, and filled with reverence. "We were never the shepherds. We were the seed." He kissed the pod. It pulsed. Above them, the bell tone sounded again. Not a chime, a breath, one long exhale, as though the entire earth had just woken from a bad dream. Then the eyes of the tree turned toward Claire, and they all blinked in unison. She did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward and offered her hand to the bark. It accepted. A root slid forward, coiling around her wrist. The ground beneath her feet pulled open. Slowly, gently, the earth consumed her, and the tree began to bloom again. But not with fruit, with faces. The orchard spread outward once more. The town of Flora vanished from all memory. Not just records, not just maps, from thought. Only Timothy Baines remained above, sitting by the steps, humming. When asked years later by a wandering historian what had happened in Flora, Timothy would smile and say, "There's no Flora. There never was. But if you dig deep enough, you'll hear the song. And if you're very lucky, it will remember you too." Timothy Baines was 10 years older by the time anyone thought to find him again. But time does strange things to people the soil remembers. He hadn't grown much. His hair was the color of frost and candlelight. His eyes, still sealed in bark, no longer wept sap. Instead, they pulsed. He lived at the edge of nothing, a field where no town had ever been, but where some said, if the wind caught right, you could hear bells from beneath the grass. He no longer needed food. He no longer slept. He lived on stories, on memory, on the company of roots that reached out to him in his dreams, whispering in spirals. The man who came to find him wore the wrong century. A linen suit, brass buttons, no dust. He said he was a folklorist, but his notebook held no ink, just pressed leaves, each etched with symbols that shimmered slightly in the sun. "I've been looking for you," the man said. "You shouldn't have," said Timothy. "Some things want to stay buried." The man knelt, as if to tie his shoe, but his fingers traced the edge of a small spiral burned into the soil. "They're saying Flora never existed. No records, no maps. But I found a ledger from 1866. It had names. A place." Timothy smiled gently. "Names are soft. Soil is not." The man opened his coat and pulled out a small jar. Inside, a breath. "Do you know whose this was?" Timothy didn't touch the jar. He only listened. Then he nodded. "Claire. You remember her?" "She remembers me." That night, the folklorist camped at the edge of where the orchard once was. He couldn't see the trees, but he could feel them shifting in the dark. Sometime after midnight, he awoke to find the jar open. Not broken, not spilled, just open, and the breath inside it gone. But the air smelled faintly of peaches. And then the humming started. Not from above, from below. The folklorist stood, notebook clutched tight, but found his legs heavy. Roots had grown up around his boots. Not many, just enough to remind him he'd been seen. Timothy sat nearby, unmoving. "She remembers you now," he said. And the spiral opened again. What came next is hard to name. The folklorist walked downward, not because he wanted to, not even because he was told to, but because the story demanded it. He descended a staircase of vertebrae and shale, the walls warm with memory. Faces bloomed like fungi on every surface, some whispering, some weeping, some laughing in reverse. At the bottom, the tree, older now, not taller, but wider. Its eyes filmed over with moss, its bark carved with new languages. Beneath it, Claire, whole, ageless, her face still hers, but rearranged, as if memory had sculpted her anew. She did not greet him. She recognized him. He dropped his notebook. The leaves within burst into flame. Silent, clean, and slow. Claire reached out. He took her hand. The tree exhaled. And the folklorist was no longer one. He was many. He saw the war. He saw the orphans. He saw the soil drink sorrow like rain. He saw each child given to the roots, not with cruelty, but with terrible hope. The orchard had never been evil. It had only ever been hungry, not for blood, for memory, for belonging. And now it had his. Above, Timothy hummed a new song, one no one had heard before, a song of someone finally returned, a song the soil now sang back. The tree never stopped growing. Its roots broke apart layers of shale, chewed through the forgotten bones of older things, and swallowed entire veins of iron. Time bent in spirals beneath it, like rings in a trunk that no longer needed years to measure its age. Instead, it counted stories. And now, it had enough to begin again. Above, the land appeared still. Just another prairie, a field, a hush. But beneath, the cathedral deepened. Claire stood at the center, her body now braided with bark, her voice only audible through the movement of leaves. Her arms had become branches, not stiff or dead, but alive with the twitching of unborn memories. She sang without mouth. She taught without words. The children encircling her no longer needed names. They were names. They were what had been forgotten. The folklorist moved through the lower orchard like a ghost, though he was far from dead. His eyes saw in spirals now. He wrote nothing down, but he remembered everything. He was a walking archive of sorrow and seed. The root mind no longer spoke to individuals. It had become too vast. Instead, it pulsed, and every pulse was a remembering. On the last day of July, something old returned. A woman from the coast, a medium by trade, a skeptic by temperament. She'd come seeking a different myth entirely. But as she walked the overgrown trail where the map showed no path, she heard a voice in the wind call her childhood nickname. No one had called her that in 40 years. She followed. She did not scream when the staircase opened. She only nodded, as if she'd always known she'd come back. Below, Timothy waited. He held out his hand. She took it. Her memories poured into the orchard like fresh rain. A mother who left. A dog who never came home. A brother lost to ice. The tree drank deeply, and when she stepped away, she smiled. She felt lighter. The root mind was not a god, but it gave peace. Not salvation, not heaven, just peace. And that was enough. The last bell. 1 year later, a tremor shook the entire Midwest. Scientists blamed shifting plates, but those who lived nearest the old Witherspoon land felt something different. They said they heard a bell, not a warning, a welcome. Crops that year grew strangely well. Apples the size of a man's head. Wheat that didn't need rain. Families who had lost entire herds found newborn calves in the grass, healthy and unafraid. But none of the old-timers ventured too close to the orchard's ghost, because in the wind, they swore they could hear singing. And sometimes, beneath that, the voices of children. Not crying, just remembering. The folklorist's final entry. No one knows where he went. The man in the linen suit. His camp remained untouched, his boots still beside the fire. But his notebook reappeared, on the steps of a library that had never heard of flora. The leaves inside had turned to vellum. The spiral etched into every page. Not ink, but root. A kind of living script, moving slightly when held to the light. The final page read only. What grows from grief is not rot, but remembrance. Let the soil sing. Let the orchard bloom. We are all roots in waiting. And then the spiral closed. For now,